During the rise of Christianity, there were many different religious philosophies which were in competition against each other. These debates included opposing ideas on the nature of God, the nature of man, and the reality in which we live. One aspect of these debates included creation theology. How are the cosmos and our world created? The more ancient view, the view most closely described by Scripture, provides imagery of God hovering over primordial waters, over formlessness and void, what Paul the Apostle called unseen or invisible things, and other writers considered to be non-being. God stretched out the heavens from this stuff, whatever you want to call it. For lack of a better word, we can call it materia. Some modern theologians have also referred to it in terms of the divine, deity, creating from non-divine actualities. I would like to reiterate what the more widely accepted theological view is, which is contrary to what I just described. The standard view of ex nihilo creation says that God is this immense, all-sufficient, incomprehensible, immutable being which filled the immensity of existence before creation. This blue-green color in the graphic represents God being everything. In other words, God was all that existed. God was the total of all existence before the creation of the universe. Then God creates everything out of nothing. The previous presentation in this series describes how this concept started and then entered into the mainstream theology starting around the mid-2nd century A.D. This marks when creation ex materia began to fall out of favor. Scholar Edwin Hatch describes the beginning of the doctrine as follows. With Basilides, the conception of matter was raised to a higher plane. The distinction of subject and object were preserved so that the action of the transcendent God was still that of creation and not of evolution, but it was out of that which was not that he made things to be. The basis of the theory was Platonic, though some of the terms were borrowed from both Aristotle and the Stoics. It became itself the basis for the theory which ultimately prevailed in the Church. The transition appears in Tatian. In order to understand what Edwin Hatch is saying here, we need to understand the original Gnostic view, and how the Gnostic thinkers Basilides and Valentinus diverted from that. In Gnostic theology, there was a supreme and utterly transcendent God who filled the immensity of existence. This God is absolutely other from anything we can imagine, and certainly nothing like us in any way. The supreme God does not act in the history of the world, but everything that exists emanated from this transcendent God. The Gnostic creation of the universe as we know it occurred as this supreme God emanated different realities, including lower gods and material chaos. One of the lower gods, Demiurge, mistakenly created the cosmos and our world. The ancients who developed and believed this theology looked at all of the death, suffering, and misery in the world and must have concluded that the world as it exists must have been an error. However, this supreme God of absolute perfection could not be blamed for such a mistake, as the Gnostics would argue, because evil does not arise from such purity. There is a problem with this theology. Ultimately, evil and imperfection did come from this supreme God. Attempting to distance the errors of that which exists from the transcendent Gnostic God does not change the fact that everything originally emanated from that God, including the Demiurge who made the mistake. This original Gnostic view was essentially creation ex Deo, creation from God itself, but in a hidden and roundabout way. Now, with the original Gnostic view more clearly understood, let's break down Edwin Hatch's analysis again. Remember, he is describing a shift away from the original Gnostic view. With Basilides, the conception of matter was raised to a higher plane. It wasn't a mistake or error. The conception of matter was purposeful. Or it wasn't the lower God who created it, It was the supreme God. The distinction of subject and object was preserved. The distinction between the Creator and the creation is preserved. God is not everything in the form of emanations. With Basilides, everything that exists is not made from God itself. It is not created ex Deo. So that the action of the transcendent God was still that of creation and not evolution. So, according to Basilides, it wasn't that emanations evolved into what was used to create the universe. Instead, it was the transcendent God who created it. But it was out of that which was not that he made things to be. In the writings of Basilides, he really described in more specific terms creation out of absolutely nothing. In summary, the problem with the original Gnostic view is that it tried to deal with the existence of evil, but ultimately the source of evil still goes back to the supreme transcendent God itself. Evil ultimately comes from God in that theory. Now enter Basilides and later Valentinus. These Gnostic thinkers wanted to get around that by saying that the emanations from God did not evolve into evil, but instead the universe was created by God from nothing, because something impure cannot come from the essence of an entirely pure being. Another point was that this God is nothing like us, and the mode of creation must be entirely different, hence creatio ex nihilo. Furthermore, it is unappealing to think that this supreme God does not know, or care, or is powerless to prevent this evolution, which perhaps is more appropriately called devolving or decaying. These Gnostic thinkers were coming up with an entirely new concept, which is why, as demonstrated in my previous video, Basilides had to go out of his way to explain that he wasn't just talking about creation from relative nothing, like previous theologians. He was talking about absolute nothing. Edwin Hatch continues in the explanation. The basis of the theory was Platonic. This is the idea that an impersonal God, the unmoved mover, who is also transcendent in Platonism, created from something that is not emanating from himself. The vocabulary used was borrowed from other groups, like Greek philosophers and Stoics. It became itself the basis for the theory which ultimately prevailed in the Christian Church. The transition appears in Tatian around 170 AD. The influences of Platonic philosophical monotheism seem to lead these revolutionary Gnostic thinkers away from the error of creation ex Deo, but imagining that something other than God pre-existed creation was incompatible with their background of God being the source of existence of all things. Therefore, the beginnings of ex nihilo theory emerged using some terms and ideas from Greek philosophy. Christianity was growing at this time, and the Judeo-Christian views were competing with these alternative philosophies. In Christianity, there was a personal God who is similar to us in that man and woman were created in God's image. While God was unlike man in terms of God's supreme power and intelligence, and God was unlike man in that God held moral perfection, God was not as viewed as entirely other as seen with the Platonists and Gnostics. In fact, God was viewed as one who does act in history. There was not an ontological divide so wide that would impede deity from also being fully human, which is a prime tenet of Christianity. This God created from the primordial waters, or unseen things. Tatian had Gnostic leanings himself, and while headed in that direction, he also began breaking precedent by trying to describe novel details concerning the creation and the relationship between God and matter, which were far beyond anything described by the original apostles. Theophilus and other Christians, like Athenagoras, began doing the same. As Edwin Hatch described, ex nihilo creation doctrine entered Christianity and eventually prevailed. Scholars describe the creation of ex nihilo dogma as occurring somewhere between Basilides, Valentinus, Tatian, and Theophilus. Along with creation theology development, there was competition concerning religious views of God's nature. God the Father in Christianity was compromised with a meld between the characteristics of the supreme Gnostic God and the Platonic unmoved mover. The resulting God is utterly transcendent, but at the same time involved by creating with purpose. And the feat of creating out of nothing appears to be an amazing demonstration of supreme power. This transition has been described as follows. Ironically, the reaction against the Marcionite and the Gnostic views put the Orthodox Christian God up to compete for superlatives with the supreme hidden God of Gnosticism, until finally the biblical Father was pushed into a transcendent alienness beyond comprehensible reality. Obviously, this super being could be no mere craftsman or artificer. You essentially have a situation where competing religious groups had an argument similar to, my dad can beat up your dad. My God is superior to your God. If the original Judeo-Christian view was God creating from something, and this idea had to compete with the superficially impressive idea of creating from nothing, then this helps explain the rise of a God who has the kind of supreme omnipotence which is beyond all reason. And these theologians appeared to dodge the problem of evil originating from God itself. When it comes down to it, should we accept ex nihilo creation theology just because, on the surface, it seems impressive? Should we reject creation ex materia because in Greek philosophical debates it made God seem like a craftsman, sculptor, or architect by comparison? What matters is whether or not our description of God and creation more adequately describes reality. In his 9-point summary against ex nihilo doctrine, Christian philosopher Thomas Hord mentions this in what he calls the historical problem. Creatio ex nihilo was first proposed by Gnostics Basilides and Valentinus, who assumed that creation was inherently evil and that God does not act in history. It was adopted by early Christian theologians to affirm the kind of absolute divine power that many Christians, especially Wesleyans, now reject. In his study on the subject, James Hubler described the development as follows. Creatio ex nihilo appeared suddenly in the latter half of the 2nd century CE. Not only did creatio ex nihilo lack precedent, it stood in firm opposition to all the philosophical schools of the Greco-Roman world. As we have seen, the doctrine was not forced upon the Christian community by their revealed tradition, either biblical texts or the early Jewish interpretation of them. As we will also see, it was not a position attested in the New Testament or even sub-apostolic writings. Ex nihilo was a position taken by apologists of the late 2nd century, Tatian and Theophilus, and developed by various ecclesiastical writers thereafter, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Origen. Creatio ex nihilo represents an innovation in the interpretive traditions of Revelation, and cannot be explained merely as a continuation of tradition. The scholars who have looked at the evidence in detail agree that the theory of creation from absolutely nothing, ex nihilo, began in the mid-2nd century. This occurred in the atmosphere of Hellenistic philosophical debates between Judaism, Christianity, Gnosticism, Platonism, and Stoicism. People who read texts before this time period as if they refer to ex nihilo either misinterpret the original language or ignore the textual historical context of the words being used. Those who argue against this scholarly consensus tend to do so based on theological tradition, not based on the evidence found in the ancient texts themselves. As we will see later in this series of presentations, ex nihilo advocates must continue to support the dogma because their theology has since been built upon this foundation.